In this lesson, what we're going to do is spend some time talking about the origins of the Labour Party. The previous video spent some time talking about the origins of the Conservative Party, and this lesson is going to do the same thing but for Labour, as I've just mentioned. Now, the Labour Party is one of the oldest and most significant parties in the United Kingdom, but it is not as old as some of the other major parties that we've explored. The Conservative Party dating all the way back to the period of the Glorious Revolution and the development of the political structure under the Stuart dynasty. The Labour Party, however, emerges in around the late 19th century, as we'll get to as we look through this video. So, essentially, the late 19th century is a time of quite significant political and social change in Britain. It's the period that sees the rise of industrialisation, a continuing rise of industrialisation, a continuing rise in urbanisation, as well as the continuing rise in the growth of the working class. Now, traditional political parties, such as the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, the Tories, largely represented the interests of the aristocracy, the landowners, and the bourgeois class. As industrialisation would begin to continue advancing, should I say, workers faced poor living conditions and poor working conditions, with very little political representation or protection. And so in response to this, the Labour Party was founded, and it was founded on the basic principle of advocating for the rights of the working class. We see this in the 1890s with the formation of the Labour Representation Committee, the LRC. The trade union movement began to gain further and further strength in the late 1800s, with workers organising in response to poor working conditions and to low wages. Now, although at the time the Liberal Party was the dominant political force, many workers felt that it did not represent their interests, particularly when thinking about economic and social values. And so in 1893, the Labour Representation Committee is established. It was established by a group of trade union leaders, socialists, and political reformers, and its goal was very simple. Its goal was to represent working class interests in Parliament. It sought to form an independent political party that would push for reforms such as better working conditions, the extension of the vote, and the introduction of social welfare policies. Some key figures in the formation of the LRC included Keir Hardie, a prominent Scottish miner and socialist, who became the first independent Labour MP in 1892, as well as Ramsay MacDonald, another very key figure within the early Labour movement. By the turn of the century then, in 1900, the LRC formally transforms into the Labour Party at the Labour Representation Conference in London in 1900. The Labour Party's early vision was based on the idea of creating a political force that basically represents the interests of the working class people, the growth of this class that came as the result of the establishment of industrialisation. The Labour Party's first leader was Keir Hardie, and its initial platform focused on achieving greater political and social reforms. So it had a number of very key initial policy advocacy. So, for example, the extension of suffrage to all men. This is something that would be later achieved in 1918 with the Representation of the People Act. It also wanted to establish a minimum wage. It wanted public ownership of essential services like railways and utilities. It wanted to reform and improve housing, healthcare and education in the working class and amongst the working class. Labour's early position was closely aligned with socialist and trade unionist movements, who sought to reduce the power of capital and to expand the role of the state in economic affairs. And so fundamentally, in terms of its early years, it struggled, at least in the early sort of half-decade of the Labour Party, to make any significant electoral gains or to make any kind of significant popularity gains, as it did compete with the more established Liberal Party that, at least ostensibly, or at least on its face, prima facie, had the support of the working class voters. In 1906, however, despite the fact that there was a Liberal Party landslide during this election, the 1906 election did see the Labour Party gain 6 seats. And so over the next decade, from 1906 to 1916 and 1920s, The Labour Party continued to grow in terms of both its popularity and its influence, particularly due to its ties with the growing of the trade union movement. Labour began to focus on the idea of social justice and an agenda of social welfare reform, which would resonate with large numbers of industrial workers. And so in thinking about the development of this political party, we can see that in the early 20th century, the sort of first half of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1945, the Labour Party continued to build its influence and its appeal. The party made slow but steady progress in national elections, with Labour increasingly positioning itself as a representative for the working class. During the First World War, the Labour Party gained popularity by advocating for workers' rights and social reform. And we see that following the First World War, Ramsay MacDonald becomes the first Labour Prime Minister in 1924. Despite setbacks and divisions, particularly the crisis on how to handle the Great Depression, Labour continued to gain traction, particularly among the industrial working class. After the end of the Second World War, the Labour government was re-elected, and under the Labour leadership of Clement Attlee, from 1945 to 1951, we see a very transformative period. We see in 1948 the creation of the NHS, the National Health Service. We see the nationalisation of key industries such as coal, steel, railways, as well as the Bank of England as well in this period. And we also see that the welfare state is expanded with programmes such as pensions, unemployment benefits, and housing. In the post-war period then, after the victory in 1945, we see that for the most part, between sort of 1945 and 1979, the party governed for the majority of this period, or for a significant amount of this period. Labour was responsible for building the modern welfare state. In conjunction with some Conservative leaders, there was this sort of period at the end of the Second World War that we call the post-war consensus. For those of you who are studying A-level history and are studying the sort of making of modern Britain topics, you will be familiar with this idea, that there's this idea of a post-war consensus, such that the major political parties, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, despite being distinct political parties with distinct ideas and ideologies and people involved, shared similar values on a number of different things, such as the welfare state, the NHS, and other issues to do with the dealing with government policy. And so in the 1960s and the 1970s, Labour's internal divisions would start to emerge. And this is one of the reasons why we see such a major shutout of Conservatives post-1979. The party's left wing, including figures like Michael Foot, began to demand more radical policies. So, for example, a stronger commitment to nationalisation and the redistribution of wealth. However, the Labour governments of the 60s and the 70s faced challenges such as industrial unrest and inflation, and it led to the rise of the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Following the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, the Labour Party would not come back into office and couldn't come back into government until 1997. And this is under the New Labour project. So in the 1990s, specifically beginning in 1994, the leadership of Tony Blair sees the rebranding of the Labour Party as this idea of New Labour. This was a shift away from the traditional socialist policies of nationalisation and state intervention towards a more market-friendly centrist approach. They were still left-wing in the general scheme of things. They were still sort of to the left of the centre, but they were more in the centre than traditional Labour views and ideas had originally essentially established. Ultimately, what we see is that the New Labour position embraced something known as the Third Way, which is attempting to reconcile some of the social ideas of socialism with market capitalism. The New Labour project was successful, winning a significant majority in 1997. They won a majority of 179 seats. And the result of that meant that Blair had a major mandate to essentially be able to do quite a lot of things. So, for example, we see the devolution of power in Scotland and Wales. We see the introduction of a minimum wage. We see significant investment in public services. We see constitutional changes like the Human Rights Act and the establishment of the Supreme Court. We see the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And we also see some major foreign policy successes. For example, in relation to NATO's role in Kosovo, or at that point in NATO's role in Kosovo and the sort of Bosnian conflicts. But then we also see some major foreign policy blunders, such as, for example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In the sort of post-Blair era, we see, firstly, the prime ministership of Gordon Brown in 2007. His tenure was marked by the global financial crisis in 2008, and his handling of the crisis was a key issue in the 2010 general election. Now, ultimately, the handling of the 2008 crisis wasn't necessarily too bad on the part of Gordon Brown, but ultimately, Labour had been in office for just too long. They'd been in office for nearly 13 years at this point. And so they were defeated by a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. And in the sort of middle period then, during the sort of last 13 or so years of the Conservative Party, we've seen that essentially a number of leaders have come and gone, with Ed Miliband taking the fold until his resignation in 2015, following the full election of the Conservatives in 2015. And then under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn from 2015 to 2020, we see the return to what would be described as more traditional socialist values, a shift even further to the left of New Labour, in the sense that Corbyn advocated for policies like public ownership of utilities, the Green New Deal, and radical redistribution of wealth. While his leadership attracted a large numbers of quite young voters and often left-wing voters, it was also alienating for more moderate and centrist voters. And what we see is that the thing that ultimately mars quite a lot of Corbyn's leadership isn't necessarily his politics. It is partially his politics. Some people are not a big fan of his politics. But also it's the fact that Brexit becomes a major challenge. And so the 2019 general election sees the issue of Brexit being at the front and centre of the major political issues. The reason why this was problematic is because Jeremy Corbyn's positions on Brexit weren't particularly comforting, in the sense that he represented quite a flip-flop kind of a position on Brexit for the most part. Historically, Jeremy Corbyn had been very critical of the European Union because of its market capitalist ideas, things like the single market, for example. But in terms of when it comes to Brexit, their policy was essentially to allow for a second referendum with Labour being neutral on the topic. This didn't really vibe very well with the new populist right that was essentially trying to bring about Brexit. And Boris Johnson's election campaign was very successful in centering and orienting the whole election around the issue of Brexit, the issue of get Brexit done, an oven-ready deal, etc., etc., etc. And so in 2020, after the defeat in the December 2019 general election, we see the election of Sir Keir Starmer into the Labour Party. Now, Keir Starmer represented a far more middling position, maybe not quite as centrist as New Labour, but definitely far more centrist than Jeremy Corbyn's positions on issues relating to social and economic policy. And it is in 2024 that we see a new landslide victory for the Labour Party, with in July 2024, Keir Starmer taking control of the of office and becoming the new Prime Minister. And since then, we have seen a number of policies being implemented. I will do a deep dive, I think, on the sort of political processes of Keir Starmer at the moment, and sort of judging Keir Starmer 1 year in when we get a bit closer to the sort of anniversary of the election.